For exactly 3.7 seconds, Bryce Wellington, 6'4", 220 pounds of pure entitlement, flew through the air like a broken toy. The sound when he hit the cafeteria table wasn't just metal bending, it was the sound of a kingdom falling. 300 students froze with forks halfway to their mouths, watching the impossible unfold before their eyes. Bryce lay there stunned, marinara sauce from someone's pizza dripping down his designer Letterman jacket, his blue eyes wide with shock, and something that looked suspiciously like fear. Madison Brooks stood over him, her petite frame somehow commanding the entire space. Her dark hair had come loose from its ponytail during the takedown, framing a face that held no anger, no satisfaction, just the calm focus of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. But Madison's hands shook slightly after the slam, not from fear, but from holding back years of compressed power that had finally found its release. In the crowd, Amber Wellington watched with tears streaming down her face, recognizing something in that moment that cut deeper than sibling loyalty. Coach Daniels dropped his coffee mug, the ceramic shattering on the floor as he whispered, "Jesus Christ," because he recognized that technique, and he knew exactly what it meant. This story isn't about revenge. It's about the moment when staying silent becomes more dangerous than speaking up, and if you've ever felt trapped by someone else's power, cornered by someone who thought your silence was consent, you'll understand why this went viral for all the right reasons. Because sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't fighting back. It's refusing to stay silent when someone finally pushes too far. To understand how we got here, we need to go back 47 days. Back to when Madison Brooks first walked through the doors of Westfield Academy, carrying a secret that would eventually explode in spectacular fashion. The moving truck outside their modest apartment complex looked almost embarrassed next to the luxury cars that filled Westfield's student parking lot. Madison stood at her bedroom window, watching her mother direct the movers with military precision, trying not to think about how this was their fourth school in 3 years. Each move came with the same promise: this time would be different. This time, they could stay. This time, her father's past wouldn't catch up with them. "Madison, honey, we need to talk." Her mother's voice carried that familiar tone of forced optimism that fooled nobody. "I know starting over is hard, but this is our last chance." Madison turned from the window, noting how her mother's hands trembled slightly as she spoke, the same tremor that appeared whenever they had to pack up their lives again. "What happens if it doesn't work this time?" "Mom." The question hung between them like a loaded weapon. They both knew the answer. There was nowhere left to run. At Westfield Academy, Madison quickly learned that money didn't just talk, it screamed. The school's Gothic architecture and manicured lawns whispered old money and older secrets, while students glided through hallways in designer clothes that cost more than most families' monthly rent. She adjusted her thrift store backpack, acutely aware of the bruised knuckles she'd carefully covered with makeup that morning, evidence of training sessions she couldn't explain to anyone, not even herself. That's when she met Sarah Mitchell, a scholarship student whose family ran the local diner downtown. Sarah had the kind of nervous energy that came from constantly looking over her shoulder, always calculating social dynamics and potential threats with the precision of someone who couldn't afford to make enemies. "Rule number 1 at Westfield," Sarah whispered during their first lunch together, glancing around the cafeteria like a prey animal checking for predators. "Don't make waves." "Rule number 2, see rule number 1. Madison followed Sarah's gaze to the center of the cafeteria, where Bryce Wellington held court like a young emperor surveying his domain, even without knowing his name. Madison could identify him as the apex predator of Westfield's ecosystem. Everything about his posture screamed entitlement and unchallenged authority. The way he commanded attention simply by existing. The way other students gravitated toward his table like planets orbiting a star. But Madison also noticed the prescription bottle he quickly palmed when he thought nobody was looking. The way his jaw clenched whenever his phone buzzed with what appeared to be texts from Dad. There were cracks in the golden boy facade, hairline fractures that suggested the pressure of maintaining perfection in a world where failure wasn't an option. "That's Bryce Wellington," Sarah explained, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "His family basically owns this town. His father's company built half the buildings you see driving in. The Wellington Foundation donated $2 million to build the new science wing." Madison watched as Principal Hawks walked past Bryce's table, her smile reserved specifically for students whose families appeared on donor lists. The administrator's body language told the whole story. Bryce Wellington wasn't just protected by wealth, he was insulated by it, wrapped in layers of institutional armor that made him virtually untouchable. That afternoon, Madison witnessed the true extent of that protection. A freshman named Kevin Palmer had made the mistake of sitting at a table Bryce's crew considered their territory, a minor transgression that would normally result in nothing more than an awkward relocation. But Bryce was having a bad day. Another argument with his father about college prospects. Another reminder that being a big fish in a small pond wouldn't matter once he graduated. "Hey there, scholarship boy." Bryce's voice carried across the cafeteria as he approached Kevin's table, his tone friendly enough that any adult would miss the underlying menace. "You lost, or just stupid?" Kevin's head snapped up, his eyes wide behind thick glasses as he realized he'd become the center of unwanted attention. Other students were already turning to watch, sensing drama in the way predators scent blood. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." "Didn't know what?" Bryce interrupted, settling into the chair across from Kevin without invitation. "That this table is reserved for people who actually belong here." Madison felt something cold and familiar settle in her stomach, the same feeling she'd experienced in every school, every town, every place where power protected cruelty and silence enabled abuse. She watched Bryce lean forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "See, Kevin, I know your name because I know everyone's name who doesn't belong here. People like you need to understand the natural order of things. You're here because we let you be here, because my family's generosity pays for your education. That comes with certain expectations." The cafeteria had gone quiet in that way that meant everyone was listening while pretending not to. Madison felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes watching a public humiliation unfold, the kind of performance that established dominance and warned potential challengers about the cost of stepping out of line. That's when Madison Brooks decided she'd seen enough. "Actually," Madison's voice cut through the tension as she stood up from her table, her tone conversational and friendly. "Kevin's reading The Outsiders for English class. Pretty sophisticated choice. Hinton's exploration of socioeconomic divisions and the arbitrary nature of social hierarchies seems relevant to our current situation." Bryce twisted in his seat to face this unexpected interruption, his handsome features marred by confusion and irritation. He'd been building to a crescendo of humiliation, and this unknown girl had just derailed his entire performance. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" Madison smiled, the expression never reaching her eyes. "Madison Brooks. I'm new. And you're Bryce Wellington." Sarah mentioned you were prominent around here. The word prominent carried just enough ambiguity to sting, without giving Bryce anything concrete to object to. Madison had turned his reputation into a question mark, suggesting that being known wasn't necessarily the same as being respected. Around them, students watched with the fascination of accident witnesses. Bryce Wellington being verbally outmaneuvered by a girl half his size was not something anyone had expected to see. "Right," Bryce said, his voice tight with controlled anger as he processed this unexpected challenge to his authority. "The new girl. Maybe you should learn how things work around here before you start running your mouth." Madison tilted her head, studying Bryce with the same clinical detachment she used to analyze opponents in the ring. "Things seem pretty straightforward. Actually, you pick on kids who can't fight back because it makes you feel powerful. Meanwhile, Kevin here is actually engaging with complex narratives about moral choices under pressure. Which one of you is really wasting their time?" The silence that followed was deafening. Bryce's face cycled through several shades of red as he realized he'd been publicly dressed down by someone who had made him look like a shallow bully without raising her voice or throwing a single insult. Kevin Rodriguez stared at Madison like she'd just pulled off actual magic. In 30 seconds, she'd done what no teacher, administrator, or intervention program had managed to accomplish. "We'll finish this conversation later," Bryce said finally, his tone carrying the kind of promise that usually made people nervous. He stood slowly, using his height advantage to loom over Madison. Most girls would have been intimidated by the display of physical dominance, but Madison met his stare without flinching. "Looking forward to it," she replied pleasantly, as if Bryce had just invited her to a study group rather than threatened her with future retaliation. As Bryce and his crew retreated, Madison could feel the weight of the entire cafeteria studying her with new interest. She'd just painted a target on her back by challenging Westfield's golden boy, and everyone knew there would be consequences. What they didn't know was that Madison Brooks had been preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation her entire life. Sarah found her after lunch, excitement and worry warring across her features. "Madison, what were you thinking? Bryce Wellington isn't someone you want as an enemy?" Madison shrugged, adjusting her backpack as they walked toward their afternoon classes. "He was picking on a kid who couldn't defend himself. Someone had to say something." "But why did it have to be you?" Sarah pressed, her protective instincts flaring despite being technically the older student. "We just got here. We can't afford to make enemies with the wrong people." What Sarah didn't understand was that Madison had been making enemies of the wrong people for years. Every underground fight, every tournament, every time she'd stepped into a ring with someone bigger and stronger had been preparation for moments exactly like this. Bryce Wellington might be rich and powerful within the narrow confines of Westfield Academy, but Madison had faced real fighters. People who'd grown up in neighborhoods where violence wasn't a game and weakness wasn't tolerated. That weekend, Madison continued her secret routine, telling Sarah she was going to the library to study. Instead, she drove to Dragon's Den Gym on the other side of town, a converted warehouse that sat in an industrial district where nobody from Westfield would ever venture. The gym's exterior gave no hint of the sophisticated training facility hidden inside, catering to serious fighters. Olympic hopefuls training for international competition. Professional MMA athletes preparing for major fights. The familiar sound of heavy bags and the rhythm of training had become as essential to Madison as breathing. Marco Razor Gonzalez ran the gym with the efficiency of someone who'd seen every kind of fighter and every type of drama. A former welterweight champion whose career had ended with a devastating knee injury. He'd channeled his expertise into developing the next generation of warriors. When Madison first walked into his gym 3 weeks ago, he'd taken one look at her stance and known she was more than just another suburban kid looking for cardio. "You move like someone who's been fighting longer than walking," he'd said after watching her work the heavy bag for 10 minutes. "Question is, what are you running from?" Madison had frozen, her fists still wrapped and ready. She'd thought their new identity was secure, that her father's past wouldn't follow them to this sleepy college town. "I don't know what you're talking about." Razor had laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine amusement. "Kid, you've got that look fighters get when they're trying to pretend they're normal people. I've been training champions for 15 years. Either you tell me your story, or I start making phone calls to find out for myself." That conversation had led to an arrangement. Madison could train at Dragon's Den in exchange for helping with the younger kids and keeping her mouth shut about what she saw. Razor understood the need for discretion. Half his clients were people who couldn't afford to have their training habits become public knowledge. 3 times a week, Madison would drive to the industrial district and transform from invisible high school student into the fighter she'd always been. She'd wrap her hands with ritual precision, lace up gloves that had become extensions of her own body, and lose herself in the mathematics of violence that most people would never understand. Her training partners knew her only as Maddie B., the girl who could hold her own against opponents twice her size and never lost her temper, even when taking punishment. What none of them knew was that Madison's underground fighting career had been far more extensive than even Razor suspected. Before her father had decided they needed to disappear, Madison had been rising through the amateur ranks with the kind of meteoric success that attracted attention from promoters and scouts. She'd been on track for an Olympic training camp when everything fell apart, when her father's gambling debts and connections to organized crime had forced them to vanish from the sport entirely. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now hiding her greatest strength: years of training, natural talent, and competitive success reduced to a secret she couldn't share with anyone. At Westfield, she was just the new girl trying to keep her head down. At Dragon's Den, she was a force of nature who could submit opponents with techniques they'd never seen coming. Monday morning brought the inevitable retaliation for her intervention on Kevin's behalf. Bryce had spent the weekend nursing his wounded pride and planning his response. He couldn't let a challenge to his authority go unanswered, especially from someone he perceived as weak and vulnerable. The harassment started small. Madison would find her locker mysteriously jammed, forcing her to get a maintenance worker to cut the lock. Her car would be blocked in the parking lot by Bryce's BMW, requiring her to wait until he decided to move it. Books would disappear from her desk during class, only to turn up in trash cans around the school. Each incident was designed to be just subtle enough that reporting it would make Madison look paranoid. Bryce was smart enough to never leave fingerprints on his psychological warfare. His friends would bump into her in hallways, always with apologies that sounded sincere to any teacher who might be listening. They'd sit near her during lunch, their conversation just loud enough for her to hear comments about new girls who don't know their place, and people who should mind their own business. Madison endured it all with the patience of someone who understood that Bryce was still in the testing phase. He was trying to establish dominance through intimidation before escalating to more direct confrontation. Every slight, every petty humiliation was Bryce's way of seeing if she would break under pressure or fight back. What Bryce didn't realize was that Madison was conducting her own test. She was studying his methods, identifying his support network, and cataloging his weaknesses. Years of competitive fighting had taught her that victory often belonged to whoever did better preparation. Understanding your opponent was more valuable than raw power or natural talent. She noticed that Bryce's confidence was entirely dependent on social validation. When his friends weren't around to witness his dominance displays, he was notably less aggressive. She observed that his harassment followed predictable patterns. He needed an audience for maximum psychological impact, preferring public spaces where humiliation would be witnessed by as many people as possible. Most importantly, Madison recognized that Bryce had never faced genuine resistance. Every target of his bullying had either submitted immediately or escalated to emotional outbursts that he could use to paint them as unstable. He had no experience dealing with someone who remained calm under pressure while carefully documenting his behavior. By Thursday of that week, Bryce's frustration was beginning to show. Madison's refusal to react was throwing off his timing and making him look ineffective to his crew. His friends were starting to make subtle jokes about Bryce's inability to break the new girl. The kind of gentle mockery that suggested his authority was beginning to crack. That's when Coach Daniels entered the picture. Richard Daniels had been Westfield's wrestling coach for 15 years. A former college champion who had built the program into a state powerhouse through a combination of technical expertise and psychological insight. He had an eye for talent that bordered on supernatural. He could spot a natural wrestler from across a crowded hallway just by the way they moved. When he saw Madison Brooks navigate through a crowd of students during passing period, something about her movement patterns triggered his professional instincts. She flowed around obstacles with the spatial awareness of someone trained in combat sports. Her balance and footwork suggesting years of serious athletic development. Coach Daniels made a few discreet inquiries. Guidance counselors were usually willing to share information about students' athletic backgrounds, especially when a coach was considering recruitment. What he discovered was puzzling. Madison's academic records were spotless, but there was no mention of any sports participation at her previous schools. That Friday afternoon, Coach Daniels made a point of walking past the student parking lot as school let out. He wanted to get another look at Madison Brooks, maybe start a casual conversation about wrestling opportunities. What he saw instead was Madison loading a gym bag into her car with the kind of careful attention that suggested expensive and important equipment. The bag itself was high-end, the kind of gear bag that serious fighters used to transport gloves, protective equipment, and training accessories. Coach Daniels recognized the brand because several of his former wrestlers had gone on to MMA careers and used similar equipment. More telling was the way Madison handled the bag, not casually tossing it into her trunk like a teenager with soccer cleats, but positioning it carefully to prevent damage. The kind of respect people showed for gear that represented significant investment and professional capability. That evening, Coach Daniels did what he always did when he encountered a mystery related to combat sports. He called his network of contacts throughout the fighting community. 15 years of coaching had connected him with trainers, promoters, and athletes across multiple disciplines. Someone would know something about a teenage girl named Brooks, who'd recently moved to their area. The third call hit pay dirt. Marco Gonzalez at Dragon's Den was initially reluctant to discuss his clients, but Coach Daniels's reputation preceded him. They'd worked together years earlier when one of Daniels' wrestlers had transitioned to MMA. Razor trusted him to keep sensitive information confidential. "Madison Brooks," Razor said slowly, weighing his words carefully. "Yeah, she trains here. Goes by Maddie B in the gym. Kid's got skills, real skills. Not the kind you pick up in a strip mall karate school." Coach Daniels felt his pulse quicken. When someone with Razor's credentials described a fighter as having real skills, it meant they were looking at legitimate talent. "What kind of background are we talking about?" "Amateur circuit superstar before she disappeared," Razor replied. undefeated record, technical precision that's off the charts, and the kind of fight IQ you usually don't see until someone's been competing for decades. Her father's Marcus Brooks used to be a professional before gambling debts caught up with him. The name Marcus Brooks triggered Coach Daniels's memory. He'd followed MMA closely enough to remember the scandal that had ended Brooks' career. Fixed fights, underground gambling, and connections to organized crime that had forced Brooks to disappear from the sport entirely. So the daughter's hiding her background to protect the family, Coach Daniels mused, pieces falling into place. What's her skill level currently? Razor's laugh carried genuine respect. She submitted a 200-pound amateur boxer last week using a triangle choke he never saw coming. Kid moves like water and hits like a truck. If she was allowed to compete openly, she'd be looking at Olympic development programs. Coach Daniels thanked Razor for the information and hung up with his mind racing. Madison Brooks wasn't just athletic. She was potentially elite-level talented in one of the most demanding combat sports in existence. The fact that she was hiding at Westfield Academy, pretending to be a normal student while secretly training at one of the region's most respected gyms, suggested a story with dangerous complications. More immediately relevant was the question of how this information changed his understanding of the situation developing between Madison and Bryce Wellington. Coach Daniels had noticed Bryce's harassment campaign, but he'd assumed Madison was just another victim who would either break under pressure or transfer to escape the abuse. Now he realized he was watching something entirely different. Bryce Wellington, used to terrorizing normal teenagers, was targeting someone who could probably put him in the hospital without breaking a sweat. Madison's restraint wasn't weakness. It was the discipline of someone who understood exactly how much damage they could inflict and chose not to. The question was how long that restraint would last, and what would happen when Bryce's escalating harassment finally pushed Madison past her breaking point. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made everything feel electric with possibility. Bryce Wellington stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting his Letterman jacket with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a battle that mattered. Today would be different. Today, he would remind everyone at Westfield Academy exactly who held the real power, starting with putting Madison Brooks back in her place. His plan was elegantly simple. During lunch period, when the cafeteria was packed with witnesses, he would publicly humiliate Madison in a way that couldn't be ignored or deflected. Not physical violence that would bring administrative consequences his father's influence couldn't wave away. Instead, something psychological, something that would break her composure and force her to react emotionally, giving him the ammunition he needed to paint her as unstable. Bryce had spent the weekend crafting the perfect approach. He would accidentally spill something on Madison's clothes, then offer to help clean it up in a way that would seem generous to observers but would actually be invasive and demeaning. When she objected, he would play the innocent victim of an overreaction. His friends would back up his version of events, and Madison would be left looking paranoid and aggressive. What Bryce hadn't counted on was that Madison had been expecting exactly this kind of escalation. Her training had taught her to read opponents, and Bryce's pattern of behavior pointed to a public confrontation designed to maximize his psychological advantage. She'd prepared accordingly, not for violence, but for the moment when hiding her strength would become more dangerous than revealing it. The cafeteria was unusually crowded that Monday. Some scheduling quirk had compressed 3 lunch periods into overlapping chaos, creating the perfect audience for Bryce's performance. Madison sat with Sarah at their usual table near the windows, picking at a sandwich while her enhanced situational awareness tracked every movement in her peripheral vision. She saw Bryce approaching before he'd taken 3 steps, the predatory focus in his movement, the way his friends flanked him for maximum intimidation effect, the phones already appearing in hands around the room as other students sensed incoming drama. This was it, the moment Bryce had been building toward since their first confrontation. "Hey there, Madison!" Bryce's voice carried that familiar tone of false friendliness as he stopped beside her table. Close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes. "Beautiful day. Isn't it perfect weather for accidents?" The last word hung in the air like a threat. Bryce's hand was already moving toward the full cup of chocolate milk on his tray, his intention crystal clear to anyone who understood the choreography of bullying. He would pour it over Madison's head, then claim it was an accident while his friends provided corroborating testimony. Sarah started to stand, protective instincts flaring. "Bryce, whatever you're planning, stay out of this, Sarah." Bryce cut her off without taking his eyes off Madison. "This is between me and your little friend here. She's been running her mouth around here like she owns the place. Time someone taught her about respect." Madison remained perfectly still, her breathing controlled and even. She could feel the weight of 300 pairs of eyes watching. Phones recording. The electric anticipation of violence that made crowds gather around accidents. This was Bryce's moment of triumph, the public humiliation that would establish his dominance and destroy her reputation. Instead, it became the moment Madison Brooks stopped hiding who she really was. As Bryce's hand closed around the chocolate milk cup, raising it toward her head with theatrical slowness, Madison's body language shifted in a way that anyone trained in combat sports would recognize. Her weight distribution changed. Her muscle tension increased. Her eyes locked onto Bryce's center of gravity with laser focus. "Last chance, Bryce," Madison said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden hush. "Walk away." Bryce laughed, a sound full of arrogance and anticipated triumph. "Or what you'll run crying to the principal again." The chocolate milk left the cup in a perfect arc, aimed directly at Madison's white polo shirt. But Madison was no longer there. In one fluid motion that defied physics and shattered every expectation in that crowded cafeteria, Madison Brooks rose from her seat and caught Bryce Wellington's wrist with surgical precision. Madison's left hand intercepted Bryce's wrist with surgical precision. Her right hand found his elbow. And suddenly, Bryce Wellington was discovering what it felt like to have his own leverage turned against him. The hip toss was textbook perfect. Madison used Bryce's forward momentum and elevated position to generate the force needed to lift his 6'3" frame completely off the ground. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Bryce Harrison floated through the air above the cafeteria table, his expression cycling through confusion, shock, and finally terror as he realized he was completely helpless. The chocolate milk he'd intended as a weapon cascaded through the air beside him, creating a surreal slow-motion ballet of humiliation. The impact when he hit the table was thunderous. Metal groaned under the sudden weight. Food exploded in every direction, and the sound of Bryce's body meeting unyielding surface echoed through the suddenly silent cafeteria like a gunshot. Chocolate milk, the weapon he'd planned to use for humiliation, cascaded down his designer clothes in brown streams that looked disturbingly like something else entirely. Madison stood over him, her petite frame somehow commanding the entire space, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing steady, her expression holding no anger or satisfaction, just the calm focus of someone who'd done exactly what was necessary and nothing more. "The next time you want to teach someone about respect," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the dead silence, Make sure you understand what real strength looks like. The aftermath exploded across social media with the speed of wildfire. Within 30 minutes, videos of Bryce Wellington's humiliation were spreading across every platform imaginable. The footage was crystal clear: Bryce's obvious intention to assault Madison, her perfect defensive technique, and his complete helplessness as he crashed through his own arrogance. Emma Rodriguez, a sophomore who had been silently recording the confrontation, found herself sitting on the most viral video of the semester. Her caption was simple: "When bullies meet consequences." By the end of the school day, Madison Brooks was trending nationally. The story had everything social media loved: an entitled rich boy getting his comeuppance, a seemingly weak girl revealing hidden strength, and a moment of justice so perfect it felt scripted. The videos accumulated millions of views, shares, and comments celebrating Madison's takedown of the archetypal high school bully. But viral fame came with complications Madison hadn't anticipated. Within hours, internet detectives had identified her real background. Amateur fighting forums recognized her technique. MMA enthusiasts connected her last name to Marcus Brooks's professional career. Reporters started digging into the family's mysterious disappearance from the sport. The secret Madison had protected so carefully was blown wide open by Tuesday morning. Every news outlet in the country knew about the underground fighting prodigy who'd been hiding in plain sight at a small-town academy. Bryce Wellington's world collapsed with equal speed. Wellington Construction lost 3 major contracts within a week as clients distanced themselves from the viral video's negative publicity. The school board demanded accountability, and his father's political ambitions evaporated as constituents made clear they wouldn't support someone who'd raised such an entitled monster. More damaging than any external consequences was the revelation of Bryce's systematic bullying campaign. Emboldened by Madison's example, dozens of his previous victims came forward with their own stories. Kevin Palmer, the freshman Madison had defended, started a support group for Bryce's targets that quickly grew to over 50 students. The picture that emerged was of a serial predator who'd terrorized vulnerable students for years while hiding behind his family's wealth and influence. Principal Hawks, faced with overwhelming evidence and public pressure, had no choice but to implement the zero-tolerance policies she'd avoided for so long. Bryce himself seemed to age a decade in a single week. The golden boy confidence that had defined his identity crumbled under the weight of universal condemnation. When he finally approached Madison to apologize, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I never thought... I didn't realize," he stammered. The arrogance completely drained from his posture. Madison studied him with the same analytical gaze she'd used during their first encounter. "You didn't realize that actions have consequences, that the people you hurt are real human beings with feelings and dignity. Or you didn't realize that someday you'd meet someone who wouldn't be intimidated by your daddy's money." The question hung between them like a challenge. Bryce could choose to learn from his humiliation or retreat further into self-pity and resentment. His answer would determine whether this experience marked the beginning of genuine growth or just another chapter in his victim narrative. "All of it," Bryce said finally, his voice breaking slightly. "I've been a terrible person. I don't know how to be better." Madison's expression softened slightly. She recognized genuine remorse when she heard it, and Bryce's complete devastation suggested this might be the shock he needed to develop actual empathy. Being better starts with making amends to the people you've hurt. Then it continues with never letting yourself become that person again. 6 months later, Madison stood at a podium in the Westfield Academy auditorium. Addressing a packed assembly about bullying prevention, and bystander intervention. Her story had inspired legislative changes. The Madison-Brooks Anti-Bullying Act required all schools receiving federal funding to implement comprehensive reporting systems and protection protocols. "I didn't want to become a symbol," Madison told the crowd, her voice steady and confident. "I just wanted to eat lunch in peace." But sometimes staying silent becomes more dangerous than speaking up. Every person in this room has a choice. You can be a bystander who enables cruelty, or you can be someone who refuses to let injustice happen on their watch. In the audience, Sarah Mitchell beamed with pride at her friend's transformation. Coach Daniels sat in the front row, vindicated in his assessment of Madison's character. Even Bryce Wellington was there, changed by months of therapy and community service, working with anti-bullying organizations to make amends for the damage he'd caused. But it was Amber Wellington's presence that meant the most to Madison. Bryce's sister had found her own voice in the aftermath of her brother's downfall, no longer living in his shadow. She'd become an advocate for siblings affected by family dysfunction and toxic masculinity. As Madison concluded her speech, the applause wasn't just appreciation, it was recognition. Recognition that courage doesn't always wear armor, that strength doesn't always announce itself, and that sometimes the most powerful response to aggression is simply refusing to be a victim. Madison's story reminds us that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't fighting back, it's refusing to stay silent, Coach Daniels said during the Q&A session. Her courage rippled through social media because people recognized themselves in her struggle. If you've ever felt powerless, her journey proves that strength comes not from staying invisible, but from standing up when it matters most. That afternoon, as Madison walked through the same cafeteria where everything had changed, she passed the table where she'd body-slammed Bryce Wellington 6 months earlier. The table had been repaired, reinforced, but more importantly, it had been transformed. Now it served as the meeting place for the Student Anti-Bullying Committee, a symbol of how destruction could become foundation for something better. The sound of Bryce hitting that table wasn't just metal bending. It was the sound of silence finally breaking. And sometimes, that's the most powerful sound in the world. Madison Brooks had learned that authentic strength protects rather than dominates, that real courage speaks up rather than stays quiet, and that the greatest victories aren't won through violence, but through the simple act of refusing to let others define who you're allowed to be. The girl who'd hidden her light under a bushel had finally stepped into the sun, and in doing so, she'd shown everyone around her that sometimes the biggest fight is accepting who you really are. Once you win that battle, every other challenge becomes just another opponent to overcome with grace, dignity, and the unshakable knowledge that your worth isn't determined by anyone else's opinion. Today, Madison Brooks continues her advocacy work, traveling to schools across the country where her story resonates with countless students who've felt trapped by someone else's power. Her message is simple, but revolutionary: silence isn't protection. It's permission. Every time someone chooses to speak up instead of staying quiet, they honor not just themselves, but every person who's ever felt too small to matter. The viral video that started it all has been viewed over 50 million times. But its real impact isn't measured in clicks or shares. It's measured in the thousands of students who've found their voice, the policies that now protect vulnerable kids, and the cultural shift that says bullying isn't just kids being kids, it's abuse that demands accountability. If Madison's story sounds familiar, if you've ever been cornered by someone who thought your silence was consent, remember, this courage isn't the absence of fear. It's deciding that someone else's behavior matters more than your own comfort, that speaking up is worth the risk. and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear. Because the world needs your voice, especially when it's shaking. 3 years later, the Madison Brooks Foundation has established anti-bullying programs in over 2,000 schools nationwide. Each one built on the principle that bystanders hold the real power to change toxic cultures. Students learn not just to recognize abuse, but to intervene safely, creating networks of support that make isolation impossible and silence obsolete. Sarah Mitchell now serves as the Foundation's youth coordinator. Her journey from frightened bystander to fierce advocate, proving that courage is contagious. She often tells audiences about watching her best friend transform from invisible victim to unstoppable force, emphasizing that heroism isn't about having superpowers, it's about using whatever power you have to protect someone who needs protection. Even Bryce Wellington has found redemption in his fall from grace. His therapy sessions and community service evolved into a passion for helping other young men recognize toxic masculinity before it destroys them. He speaks at father-son workshops about the pressure to dominate rather than connect, his vulnerability in sharing his story more powerful than any display of false strength ever was. But perhaps the most profound change has been in the countless quiet kids who've realized they don't have to stay quiet. Every week, the Foundation receives letters from students who've found their voice, who've stood up to bullies, reported abuse, or simply refused to laugh at someone else's pain. Each story proves that Madison's 3.7 seconds of courage created ripples that will continue spreading for generations. The cafeteria table at Westfield Academy bears a small plaque, now, in honor of those who refuse to stay silent. It's become a pilgrimage site of sorts. Students from across the country visit to see where one girl's decision to stop hiding changed everything. Madison Brooks learned that day that strength without compassion is just cruelty in disguise, that real power lies not in dominating others, but in empowering them to find their own strength. Her story continues to inspire because it reminds us of a fundamental truth: we all have more power than we realize. And the moment we choose to use it for justice rather than self-protection, we discover who we were always meant to be. The revolution starts with one voice refusing to whisper. Yours might be next.